Hi, my name is Jennifer Lentz, and this is my systematic review for Module 12. My portfolio title is Improving U.S. Military Personnel Physical Readiness Through Evidence-Based Exercise Instruction and Interventions, and my paper title from this semester is Prescription Exercise Programming in Preparation for the Army Combat Fitness Test. My research problem and focus are as follows. The problem is that U.S. Army soldiers have limited access to fitness training resources, professionals, and deliberate programming in preparation for the Army Combat Fitness Test, or the ACFT, which may lead to a lack of physical readiness in conjunction with distal injuries arising from a weak lumbopelvic hip complex. The purpose of this review is to demonstrate how physical training programs incorporating high-intensity functional training can improve athletic outcomes and reduce the occurrence of distal injuries from a weak lumbopelvic hip complex in U.S. Army soldiers. So the first article that I'm reviewing is titled Risk Factors for Musculoskeletal Injuries in the Military, a qualitative systematic review of the literature from the past 2 decades and a new prioritizing injury model. The purpose of this article was a systematic overview of all risk factors for musculoskeletal injuries in the military to address and discuss the facilitation of successful interventions. Some assumptions that were made were that there was equal value placed on both self-reported injuries and then actual practitioner measured injuries or scientifically measured injuries. So they just kind of assumed that they all had the same value. Then some strengths were that this paper looked at more than 10,000 subjects across 179 papers, which also included 3 metas in addition to those 179. It was inclusive of modifiable and non-modifiable influencers and contributors to risk factors. So modifiable meaning your BMI or your body weight or your body fat percentage. Non-modifiable meaning your sex or your age, meaning that you can't change it, whereas those modifiable risk factors could be changed or influenced. The authors put together a 5-grade scale, which was helpful in seeing exactly how some of the risk factors were really rated as far as strongly linked to musculoskeletal injuries versus the data was just non-existent or inconclusive or not enough or incomplete. So they provided this grading scale to help you kind of understand exactly how the information in the data presented those risk factors for you to understand how they related to those injuries. Then also they added an additional order ranking to that, first order, second order, third order, if they directly influenced another risk factor for musculoskeletal injuries. So that also helped kind of understand the significance of those risk factors. Some of the limits, this review did not include calculated effect sizes or a meta-analysis for every single risk factor. It was across all nations, which the authors discussed might not have been the best idea for relating one military to the next. This was, they looked at Air Force, Army, Marines, Navy, and then they also looked at multiple nations, which they have differences in and of themselves as well. So there were some limits there to it not being of the exact same populations under the exact same circumstances, but they are all relatable in that they are all armed forces. They also excluded anything that was published before the year 2000, just to keep it closer to more state-of-the-art training, implementation of exercise prescription, um, war zone injuries, that kind of thing. So they kept it to that. There also was no psychological, cognitive, or behavioral risk factor identified across any of the studies for musculoskeletal injuries. And then finally, the methods, they use the PRISMA guidelines initiated using the PubMed, Ovid Medline, and Web of Science databases with the search terms military and injury or trauma, and then basic training or physical training, which would be PT, with all mesh terms. The variables that they were looking at here included 57 different risk factors for musculoskeletal injuries across military personnel. Um, some of those risk factors were ranked from no evidence to strong scientific evidence. So again, that was their rank order. Those strong scientific evidence risk factors, some of them that they found that really contributed strongly and that there was strong scientific evidence linking them to musculoskeletal injuries among military personnel were smoking. It increased by 27 to 71%. Underweight, meaning that their BMI was underneath an 18.5. Overweight, greater than 25 BMI. Obesity, BMI greater than 30, higher body fat, no or low participation in sports before military service time, and high amounts of training during unit training. All of those contributed to strong scientific evidence for musculoskeletal injuries. All of those were high risk factors for that. Some moderate evidence risk factors were like lower muscular strength. So they were saying that you really needed to focus on increasing muscular strength because it would help soldiers with decreasing those musculoskeletal injury rates. Something that was interesting was that they took like the muscular strength um, risk factor and tied it to a vitamin D deficiency, which vitamin D deficiency was another risk factor, but it was considered like a second order factor to low muscular strength, and the low muscular strength was considered a first order risk factor. So the first order risk factor was like the main reason, right? So you had low muscular strength, and maybe a second order that kind of contributed to that low muscular strength was because they might have had like a vitamin D deficiency. So they were trying to kind of tie it all together so it wasn't just 57 risk factors across the board. There was some connection between them. So the model established by the authors here provides a really great foundation for understanding which risk factors would be most important to address, and especially in which order when planning interventions. They highlighted exactly which ones had the strongest scientific evidence, which ones were lacking, which ones required further research. They really did a great job of identifying all of the different contributing factors, except for obviously those psychological, cognitive, and behavioral that weren't looked at, that they just couldn't find, and maybe they, didn't search the right things. They weren't really sure why that didn't show up because they noted that in regular athletic populations, all of those risk factors are discussed. Um, in abundance is what they kind of implied. So it was interesting that they couldn't find anything from a military perspective. The second article that I looked at was the benefits and risks of CrossFit systematic review. So I started to kind of switch gears a little bit this semester and really hone in on identifying what information I was going to give to military personnel. What was the point of me searching through all this information and finding all of these reasons and risk factors and injury rates and finding all of this and telling them, hey, you know, you need to be better at this. You need to have deliberate training. You need to have exercise prescription. You need to have good coaches. You need to have people telling you how to move correctly. You know, what's the point of me telling them all of those things if I'm not actually telling them what's going to help them, right? Oh, well, you need to, you know, it's like you need to go mow the lawn. Well, if you tell somebody to go mow the lawn and they don't know how to run a lawnmower, you know, you might not get the results that you want. So I really kind of switched gears and I looked at, for my article for the semester, I looked at publishing in a journal that it would conflict with CrossFit. So had to get rid of the label CrossFit, which is typically known as high intensity functional training. So I looked at anything and everything under the sun that had high intensity functional training. And I just kind of ran with it. And it was really, really interesting to find that, you know, I've done CrossFit for 12 years now, and I never knew that there was so much information out there that actually supports CrossFit as far as injury rates are concerned. And you kind of hear, oh, everybody gets injured in CrossFit. Everybody gets injured in CrossFit. Well, it's funny because they don't actually. The data shows differently. So I'm really excited to have actually shifted gears and be able to support something with backed up, evidence-based information from the data. I mean, I'm so excited to be able to share this. So let's dive into this. So the purpose here was to assess the benefits and risks associated with participation in CrossFit interventions. The assumptions here were that CrossFit is associated with high risks, which again, we're going to come to find is not typically the case when you look at the injury rates compared to other sports, or even the numbers in the amount of hours that people train. The strengths, there were 2,300 plus participants across 13 studies that were considered. However, the limits are also that there were only 13 studies examined here. It could have been more. However, this was from 2017. So some of the research at that point had been collected from 2012, as far back as 2012, but CrossFit had not been around any earlier than 2000. And to try to have a lot of data surrounding it back in 2012 just really wasn't there yet. So either way, moving forward, again, the age of the references mentioned there, but there were only 13 studies that examined CrossFit in various ways, including the consideration of its safety and benefits from 2017. So the review of the literature used the PRISM protocol exactly like the other article that I reviewed here, and the database was searched for CrossFit and high intensity interval training. So the variables that were considered here were benefits of CrossFit. So again, looking at anything that linked with CrossFit and high intensity interval training, high intensity functional training as well, and then reported CrossFit injury rates. So looking at all of the numbers that were associated with the data that was found in those in the searches. The results, something that was really interesting was one researcher found that 74% of all runners experience a moderate or severe injury each year, which is significantly higher than the injury rate of 19.4% among CrossFit participants. I also had found information that said that the rate of injury was 3% across 1,000 hours of CrossFit. So if you look at someone who does an hour of CrossFit 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, right? Because they are going to take vacations and things like that. So if they do 5 hours a week, 1 hour a day, they go to 1 hour class 5 days a week, and then you times that by 50 weeks a year, you're looking at 250 hours. So we're talking about an injury rate, 3% injury rate across a 4-year time span. That's just, it's kind of incredible to think about when you look at it in those numbers, because we're not talking about people who are being injured, immediately. Another article that I had read said that when you had coaches offering a fundamentals program, or they typically call it like an on-ramp program, it's when you go through every single movement that CrossFit has and you learn how to do it correctly, and you get coached on it, and you get bar technique, and you get feedback. When you go through a program like that with a coach, with a certified coach, before you just start taking classes, the people were able to reduce their risk of injury. They were able to reduce injury rates by nearly 20%. It was like 18.5 or 18.9% reduction in injury rates, which that's huge. Every gym should have that. More importantly, our military soldiers or airmen or sailors, whatever the case may be, they should have those same kinds of coaches and staff and opportunities available to them, because what about all those brand new cadets coming in? What about all those all new trainees coming in? If they came from a phys ed program right in high school that did not even have gym, how do they know how to squat? How do they know how to pick a barbell up? How do they know how to move? How do they know how to do a push-up? How do they know how to put anything up overhead where they're not going to damage their rotator cuff? They don't know these things. And then you just throw them into mandatory PT, where it's like, hey, let's see who can come up with the hardest workout in the world and who can do it the fastest and at the heaviest. It's just it's a recipe for disaster. So to look at all of this information and then be able to say to people, listen, if you have coaches who can provide you foundational movements, if you can provide information and feedback to these people who don't know how to move properly yet, and you can help them to move properly, you're going to reduce your injury rates. If you start removing some of those crazy amounts of running that you do with your PT groups, you're going to reduce your incidence of injuries. It's all information that's really relevant and important to the military, because the number one cause of soldiers not being able to perform their military responsibilities are musculoskeletal injuries. Musculoskeletal injuries account for 80% of all injuries in the Army. That's mind-blowing. So when a CrossFit athlete is familiar with the program's movements, exercises, and expectations, CrossFit's effectiveness increases. So all of those benefits that come with CrossFit, an increase in lean body mass, a reduction in body fat percentage, bone density, VO2 max, muscular strength, muscular endurance, speed, power, balance, agility, coordination, all of those things that come from CrossFit implementation are effectively increased when athletes are familiar with the movements and the exercises and expectations. How do you do that? You have to run them through the foundations and through the movements so that they understand it better. So, I kind of just did this slide and the last slide, but some of the implementations for practice here are that CrossFit, just as any other high intensity training, increases VO2 max, strength, musculature, and endurance, and decreases lean body mass. The recommendations from the literature suggest assessments of previous injuries. So they found that um, athletes who had a previous injury were almost 4 times, it was 3.75 times more likely to sustain an injury in high intensity functional training or CrossFit if they came in or had a previous injury. So what can you do? Talk to your athletes, talk to your service members, and if they have an injury, send them off to the referrals that they need so that they can get fixed before they come in, and then you make either that injury worse or add on another injury. And then you're just losing duty time and duty days for those soldiers. And that just costs the Army money. It costs them a lot of money to lose soldiers that they've put a lot of time and effort and energy into. Fundamental and on-ramp programs, key to preventing injuries. And then experience and certification levels of your coaches should really be sort of verified and evaluated to make sure that they're able to teach proper technique and movement, coach it in the moment, fix it in the moment, scale it when it needs to be scaled for someone, modify it when it needs to be modified for someone, and really be able to kind of lead an entirely different group of athletes through the same workout, even though they all may be doing different things at different weights. And a good coach can do that. A good coach with experience and the right certification level can walk an entire group through the same workout, even though they all may be doing different things. And they'll all accomplish their goals of an exercise or a workout. So again, in conclusion, really, we need to lower our injury rates with appropriate execution and implementation of on-ramp or fundamental programming. Um, Ron et al. States that 80% of all injuries in the Army come from are musculoskeletal injuries. And we could have a significant impact on reducing that number just by implementing the right kind of PT for our soldiers. Risk factors for injury can be influenced by positive CrossFit high intensity interval training implementation. So if we can find that good foundational or fundamental programming, if we can get deliberate exercise prescription for soldiers, if we can make sure that we're identifying those previous injuries beforehand, if we can do all of these things in the right way, then we can really help drive home physical readiness for our soldiers, higher scores on the ACFT, and reducing injury rates. Here are my references, and thanks for listening.